Something deep inside tells us that something big is coming. That what we're seeing across the world isn't random, the confusion, the moral collapse, the hostility toward truth. It's all too familiar. We've seen this pattern before in scripture, in history, in fallen empires, and just like before, humanity stands on the edge of another turning point. What's coming next will shock the world, not because it's unexpected, but because we ignored the warnings. God is not silent. The shaking we see is not chaos. It's a call. History is repeating itself. And the question is whether we'll wake up before it's too late. Time humanity reaches a new height in knowledge or technology, we start believing that we've outgrown the need for God. We convince ourselves that progress means independence, that intelligence equals wisdom, and that morality can evolve with culture. But every time we've gone down that path, history has humbled us, because what God has established as truth doesn't change with time. It transcends it. And when humanity tries to rewrite what he already perfected, we don't create progress. We create confusion. That's exactly what's happening again today. We're living in a generation that celebrates its enlightenment, but quietly suffers from emptiness. We've traded God's order for our own ideas, thinking that freedom means doing whatever feels right in the moment. But real freedom isn't the absence of boundaries. It's the presence of truth. When you remove truth from freedom, you don't get liberation, you get chaos. Look at the world around us. Moral lines have blurred, values are fluid, and identity has become a question mark instead of an anchor. The more we try to improve God's design, the more we lose ourselves in the process. It's the same pride that destroyed Eden. The serpent didn't tempt Eve with rebellion. He tempted her with the illusion of enlightenment. You will be like God. That's the same lie repeating today in new forms through technology, ideology, and the belief that humanity can define its own reality. We want to be the author instead of the creation, to sit on the throne instead of kneel before it. But the moment man tries to play God, the moral structure of life begins to crack. Because the human heart was never designed to carry divine authority without divine submission. Look back through history. The Tower of Babel was humanity's attempt to build greatness apart from God, and it ended in confusion. Rome thought it could rule the world without righteousness, and it fell into decay. Even Israel, chosen and blessed, turned from God to idols, and their glory faded into captivity. The pattern is as old as time. When humanity elevates itself, it collapses under its own pride. God doesn't have to destroy us. Our rebellion does the work for him. Psychologically, it's easy to see why. The human soul craves order, purpose, and stability. But when you remove God's truth, those cravings don't disappear, they just redirect. We start worshiping success, power, pleasure, or self. And when those idols fail to satisfy, anxiety and emptiness fill the gap. We call it a mental health crisis, but beneath it lies a spiritual identity crisis. People don't know who they are because they've forgotten whose they are. And that's what happens when humanity rewrites what God already perfected. We lose the blueprint of our own being. What makes this repetition terrifying is that it's disguised as progress. People truly believe they're building a better world. But without truth, progress becomes destruction with good intentions. We say we're evolving, but we're really just repeating the same rebellion that's written across the pages of Scripture. The costumes have changed, but the story hasn't. The same pride that blinded Pharaoh, that seduced Babylon, that destroyed Rome, it's alive and breathing in our generation. The difference is this time it's global. And yet, even in the midst of rebellion, God's grace is still calling. He doesn't destroy without first warning. He doesn't judge without first offering mercy. History keeps repeating because humanity keeps ignoring that mercy. But the moment we remember, the moment we humble ourselves and return, the cycle can be broken, because what God established from the beginning wasn't meant to be rewritten. It was meant to be revealed, lived, and honored. The next time you hear someone say, we're evolving beyond old beliefs, remember this. Truth doesn't evolve, it endures. What's new isn't always what's right, and what's ancient isn't always outdated. God's design doesn't need revision, it needs recognition. Because history will always repeat itself when we try to improve on what was already perfect. Deception has always been the enemy's favorite weapon because it doesn't announce itself with horns and darkness. It comes dressed in light, wrapped in clever words and disguised as progress. The world doesn't collapse overnight. It erodes slowly through the decay of discernment. People stop recognizing truth, not because it disappears, but because they've been conditioned to stop looking for it. That's what's happening in our generation right now. Deception has become normal and truth has become offensive. You can turn on the news, scroll through your feed, or sit in a classroom and see it unfolding. Lies have become so sophisticated that they sound intelligent. They appeal to emotion, to empathy, to the desire to belong. That's why deception is so dangerous. It doesn't confront you, it comforts you. It tells you exactly what you want to hear. It says, do what feels right, follow your heart, live your truth. But there's only one problem. If everyone has their own truth, then no one has the truth. And when truth becomes relative, deception becomes absolute. This isn't new. It's ancient. In the garden, Eve didn't eat the fruit because she was evil. She ate it because she was convinced it was good. That's the psychology of deception. It always makes wrong look right. It flatters your intellect while blinding your spirit. It appeals to your curiosity but steals your clarity. And that same lie has simply evolved. The devil doesn't need to convince people that God doesn't exist. He only needs to convince them that God doesn't matter, that life can function just fine without him. And when that belief takes root in a culture, truth begins to die in silence. Philosophically, deception thrives in the absence of absolutes. When there's no standard, no anchor, no moral compass, the loudest voice becomes the truth. People start believing not because something is real, but because it's repeated. The more a lie is broadcast, the more believable it becomes, and that's how societies are shaped, not by facts, but by frequency. We've created an echo chamber of confusion, where lies are recycled, truth is redefined, and discernment is dismissed as judgmental. Spiritually, this is where the battle is most intense. The enemy's goal has never changed, to separate humanity from truth, because truth is what sets us free. He doesn't fight with swords anymore. He fights with screens, slogans, and systems designed to dull the human spirit. People don't even realize they're being deceived because the deception is so well packaged. It looks like freedom, but it's actually bondage in disguise. It looks like love, but it's manipulation. It looks like inclusion, but it's indoctrination. And when deception takes the throne, discernment becomes a threat. What's terrifying is that even the church isn't immune. When pulpits become platforms for popularity instead of truth, deception finds a home in the very place designed to expose it. When preachers stop offending sin to avoid offending sinners, the light begins to dim. The devil doesn't fear a church that entertains. He fears a church that discerns, because discernment is what separates the faithful from the fooled. But here's the deeper truth. Deception can't survive where people are anchored in God's word. Lies lose their power in the presence of light. The human soul was designed to crave truth. That's why even when people run from it, they can't escape the emptiness of living without it. Deception may be persuasive, but it's never permanent. Eventually the mask falls, and the consequences reveal what the comfort concealed. So, what do we do in a world like this? We sharpen our discernment by anchoring ourselves in truth. We stop believing everything that sounds good and start testing everything by what is good. We don't just read the word, we live by it until deception has no place to hide. Because in a time when the world worships falsehood, standing for truth isn't arrogance, it's obedience. Deception may dominate the headlines, but it doesn't have to dominate your heart. The same spirit that led Daniel through Babylon, that gave Esther courage before a king, that gave Jesus clarity in the wilderness, that same Spirit still lives in those who choose truth over comfort. So remember this: deception only wins when discernment stays silent. Speak truth, even when it shakes the room, because truth doesn't just expose lies, it extinguishes them. Power always reveals what was hidden beneath the surface. Give someone authority, and you'll see their true heart. Take power away, and you'll see their true faith. Every generation faces a test of power: who holds it, how it's used, and whether it serves truth or corrupts it. What we're witnessing in the world today isn't random chaos. It's a deliberate reshuffling of power, political, spiritual, and moral. And if you listen closely, you can hear history echoing in the background, whispering warnings we've heard before but refuse to heed. The shift in power has always been the stage upon which nations rise and fall. When truth loses influence, tyranny takes the throne. When moral authority weakens, manipulation becomes the new leadership. And when God is removed from the center, humanity starts to orbit around its own ego. That's where we are now, in an age where power is being concentrated in the hands of a few, while the majority are distracted by entertainment, misinformation, and fear. It's not just politics, it's psychology. Control the narrative, and you control perception. Control perception, and you control behavior. We've entered a time when the powerful don't need to force submission. They just need to shape your thinking. They don't silence truth outright. They drown it out with noise. They don't remove freedom. They redefine it until it means nothing. It's a quiet takeover, subtle and sophisticated. And most people don't realize it's happening because they're too busy being entertained by the very system that's enslaving them philosophically. Every empire that collapses shares the same flaw: power without principle. When ambition replaces accountability, when greed overshadows gratitude, and when leaders seek to be gods rather than serve God, destruction is inevitable. History has shown this repeatedly. Rome fell not because of a lack of strength, but because of moral rot. Babylon crumbled, not from outside forces, but from internal arrogance. The same spirit exists today. The spirit that says, we can build our own tower to heaven. But every time humanity tries to replace God, it ends up replacing freedom with fear. Spiritually, this moment is not just political, it's prophetic. The Bible warned that in the last days, there would be an alignment of power, nations joining for convenience rather than conviction, systems designed to control rather than serve, leaders rising who promise peace but deliver deception. It's not the rise of power that's alarming, it's the source of it. Because when power is detached from divine authority, it becomes destructive. We see it in the normalization of corruption, the celebration of confusion, and the silencing of conviction. The systems of the world are being prepared for a shift that's both historical and spiritual. The question isn't if power will change hands, it's who will be holding it when it does. Will it be those who seek to control people or those who seek to serve God? But here's the part that many overlook. God has never lost control. When earthly powers rise, it's not because heaven went silent, it's because heaven is setting the stage. Every empire that exalts itself above God eventually collapses under its own weight. That's not just history, that's divine law. So when we see power being misused, when we watch leaders act without conscience, and when truth seems buried under propaganda, we shouldn't lose faith. We should recognize that God is exposing what man tried to hide. The wise understand that true power doesn't come from position, it comes from purpose. It's not about how many people obey you, it's about how faithfully you obey God. The greatest leaders in history weren't the ones with the most followers, but the ones who refused to bow to the world's systems. Moses stood before Pharaoh with nothing but a staff and truth. Daniel stood in Babylon with nothing but prayer and conviction. Jesus stood before Pilate with nothing but authority that couldn't be seen. And that's the kind of power that changes eternity. So yes, the world is shifting, the thrones of men are shaking, systems are rearranging, but don't mistake instability for defeat. Sometimes God allows the towers of power to crumble so that truth can finally be seen again. When power is misused, stand for principle. When authority is abused, cling to integrity, because in a time when power is being redefined, your obedience to truth will be the greatest resistance you can offer. Remember this, the hands that seem to control the world are never greater than the hands that created it. Power belongs to God, always has, always will. One of the most unsettling truths about human history is how quickly morality decays when comfort replaces conviction. Every civilization that has risen to greatness eventually began to rot from the inside. Not because of external enemies, but because its people lost the moral compass that once guided them. When truth becomes optional, righteousness becomes irrelevant. And that's when the soul of a nation begins to die. What's terrifying about our current moment is that the pattern is unfolding again right before our eyes. We're watching the erosion of values that once held society together. And most people are too distracted to notice the spiritual cost. You see, moral decline doesn't happen overnight. It starts quietly. It starts when people begin to redefine good and evil on their own terms. It starts when comfort becomes more important than character. The moment we begin to justify wrong in the name of progress, we set the stage for corruption to take root. And once morality becomes a matter of opinion, truth becomes a matter of convenience. That's where we are today. We live in a world where lying is rebranded as strategy, immorality as freedom, and selfishness as self-expression. This moral confusion is not accidental. It's engineered. When the enemy of truth wants to destroy a people, he doesn't need to attack them directly. All he has to do is blur the line between right and wrong until people can no longer tell the difference. And when that happens, judgment always follows. Not because God delights in punishment, but because a world without moral boundaries will eventually destroy itself. Look through history. Every empire that ignored moral truth eventually imploded. Babylon had power but lost purity. Rome had influence but lost integrity. And every time they fell, it wasn't the swords of enemies that brought them down. It was the sins they refused to confront. There's a profound psychological truth here too. When individuals abandon moral clarity, they don't just lose their way, they lose their peace. Guilt becomes numbness, confusion replaces conviction, and the soul becomes restless. You can have every material comfort in the world and still be spiritually bankrupt. And that's exactly what's happening across our culture. We have more information, but less wisdom, more pleasure, but less fulfillment, more options, but less direction, because morality isn't a restriction, it's protection. It's what keeps freedom from becoming chaos and passion from becoming destruction. The philosophical heart of this crisis is pride, the belief that humanity can redefine truth without consequence. That's what makes moral decay so seductive. It tells people they can be their own gods, that they can create their own version of right and wrong, and that no higher standard exists. But once society adopts that mindset, it's already on the path to collapse, because truth, by its very nature, cannot be rewritten. It can only be ignored for a time. And when truth is ignored, judgment becomes inevitable. Yet even in this decline, there's hope, because God never exposes darkness without offering light. The purpose of conviction isn't condemnation, it's correction. He allows a nation to feel the weight of its moral confusion so that it might awaken to its spiritual need. Every collapse in history was also an opportunity for renewal. When morality dies, revival becomes not just necessary, but possible, because when people have had enough of deception, they start hungering for truth again. That's why this moment matters. We're not just watching moral decline, we're being called to respond to it. Each of us has the power to rebuild what has been lost, not by shouting louder, but by living truer. Integrity still has influence. Purity still has power. Righteousness still has a voice. And when one person stands for what's right in a world that celebrates wrong, heaven takes notice. So don't despair when you see the moral decay around you. Let it drive you to become the example others are too afraid to be. Because while history may repeat itself, you have the chance to be part of a generation that breaks a cycle. In the end, nations rise and fall, but truth remains. And when everything else collapses, it's only those anchored in moral and spiritual conviction who will still be standing when a culture drifts into chaos. It's not because the darkness got stronger, it's because the light grew dim. Evil doesn't gain power by force, it gains power through the silence of good people. The moral collapse we see around us today isn't simply the result of corruption or deception, it's the result of complacency, a collective spiritual sleep. People stop paying attention, stop standing firm, stop believing their choices mattered. And when enough people become indifferent, evil becomes invisible until it's too late. There's something deeply psychological about this pattern. Human beings crave comfort more than confrontation. We prefer peace, even if it's false peace, over the discomfort of standing against wrong. The enemy of truth doesn't need to defeat you. He just needs to distract you. He wants you busy enough not to notice the erosion of your values, entertained enough not to question injustice, and comfortable enough to stop caring about what's happening around you. That's how societies lose their moral ground. Not through war or revolution, but through quiet indifference. Spiritually, this apathy is one of the greatest dangers of our time, because when people stop living with conviction, faith becomes a ritual instead of a force. Churches fill with sound but lack substance. Believers quote scripture but don't embody it. The world doesn't just need people who can recite truth. It needs people who live it, even when it costs them something. God never called his people to blend in. He called them to stand out. But standing out requires courage. And courage always comes with conflict. Throughout history, the strongest revivals began in the weakest moments, when the faithful few refused to bow to the system around them. Daniel didn't survive Babylon by staying silent. He survived because he prayed when it was illegal to pray. Esther didn't save her people by hiding. She saved them by risking everything to speak truth in a hostile palace. These were ordinary people with extraordinary conviction. They understood something most people forget. When God is with you, standing alone is never standing small. But let's bring this closer to home. The world is once again dividing between those who live by convenience and those who live by conviction. The question each of us has to face is simple. Which side are we on? It's easy to criticize what's wrong in the world, but harder to take responsibility for being the light in it. Too many people are waiting for someone else to fix what they themselves were called to confront. But the truth is, revival never starts in crowds. It starts in hearts. When one person says, I refuse to compromise, heaven takes notice. Philosophically, moral courage is the foundation of civilization. Without it, laws become hollow, institutions become corrupt, and truth becomes negotiable. A society can only rise as high as the integrity of its people. And that means the real battle isn't political, it's spiritual. The question isn't who's in power, but who's influencing the soul of the people. Because the strongest weapon against darkness isn't anger or argument, it's integrity lived out daily. There's also a psychological weight to moral courage. Standing for truth often isolates you. It can cost you friends, opportunities, or comfort. But if you let fear dictate your faith, you'll lose both. Compromise may feel safer in the moment, but it always leaves you weaker in the long run. There's no peace in pleasing everyone when your conscience knows you've betrayed what's right. Courage doesn't remove fear, it moves through it. And every time you choose conviction over comfort, Your spirit grows stronger and your influence deepens. That's what this moment demands. People of principle who refuse to bow to pressure. People whose loyalty to truth outweighs their fear of rejection. People who realize that moral courage is contagious. When one person stands firm, others find the strength to stand too. And before long, that spark becomes a flame that can reignite a generation. So as the world repeats the patterns of moral decay and spiritual blindness, don't repeat the mistake of silence. Choose to be the exception. Choose to live as a light, even when the world mocks you for it, because the future doesn't belong to those who blend in. It belongs to those who stand firm. In the end, history doesn't remember the comfortable. It remembers the courageous. And if history is repeating itself, then let it repeat with a remnant that refuses to bow, a generation that stands tall, and a people who understand that when truth is all you have left, it's still more powerful than everything the world can offer. When everything around you seems to be collapsing, institutions failing, values fading, truth being mocked, it's easy to believe that hope is gone, but history reminds us that every time the world fell into darkness, light found a way to return. God has a way of turning endings into awakenings. What we're seeing right now is not the destruction of everything meaningful, but the exposure of what was false. The shaking you see in the world is not meant to destroy. It's meant to reveal. It's separating the genuine from the counterfeit, the faithful from the fearful, and the strong from the comfortable. You see, divine resets never happen without disruption. Before God rebuilds, he breaks. Before he restores, he reveals. We're living in a time of revealing, a time when hearts, motives, and loyalties are being tested. The systems we trusted are crumbling because they were built on sand, not stone. And the people who built their lives on comfort are discovering that comfort can't save you when truth collapses. This moment in history isn't just another cycle. It's a divine confrontation. God is confronting the arrogance of man, the apathy of believers, and the illusion that we can control the future without him. There's a deep psychological truth to this. People change in one of two ways, through inspiration or desperation. When inspiration fails, God allows desperation to wake us up. And that's what's happening across the world. The illusion of control is being stripped away. The things we used to rely on, money, power, technology, influence, are proving fragile. The human ego is being humbled because no matter how advanced we become, there are still storms we can't stop, diseases we can't cure, and chaos we can't predict. God is allowing the world to see that without him, progress becomes emptiness and knowledge without wisdom becomes destruction. But here's the paradox. What terrifies the world can transform the faithful. Every shaking carries within it a hidden invitation, a call to return to what's real. When everything else fails, faith becomes visible again. When fear spreads, courage becomes contagious. When lies multiply, truth becomes magnetic. The crisis you see isn't the end of God's plan. It's the clearing of the stage for his next move. Just as the flood made room for a new covenant and the wilderness prepared the way for promise, the chaos of today is preparing the soil for a revival unlike anything we've seen before. Philosophically, history always resets when humanity hits the limits of its own wisdom. Every empire that reached its peak eventually discovered that power without God leads to emptiness. And after every collapse came renewal, not through politics or systems, but through people who rediscovered purpose. That's how God works. He doesn't need the majority. He needs the faithful. He doesn't start revival in the halls of power, but in the hearts of those who still believe. This is where our choice comes in. We can either panic with the world or prepare with God. We can either interpret the shaking as punishment or recognize it as positioning, because God doesn't shake what's built on him. He shakes what's built without him. If your foundation is truth, this storm isn't your downfall. It's your awakening. It's the reminder that while everything else can be shaken, his kingdom cannot. Spiritually, this is not the time to shrink back. It's the time to stand firm. You may feel small compared to the chaos, but remember, darkness has never defeated light. It only exposes where light needs to shine. When others give up, you stand up. When the world chooses fear, you choose faith. When truth is ridiculed, you speak it louder, not with arrogance, but with conviction. Because the moment you start living as if God is still in control, you'll see what most people can't. That every collapse in history has always been a setup for divine intervention. So as history repeats itself, don't lose heart. What's coming next may shock the world, but it shouldn't shock the faithful. The same God who guided Noah through the flood, who led Moses through the wilderness, and who raised Jesus from the grave, is the same God who's still at work today. He doesn't repeat history to destroy us. He repeats it to remind us. And maybe that's the greatest truth of all. Every time man builds a world without God, God allows it to fall, not to end it, but to rebuild it on truth again. So don't fear the shaking. Be the reason others find stability in it. Because when everything else falls apart, faith isn't just your anchor, it's your testimony. The world may tremble, but those who stand on God's truth will never fall.